Hello there, my name is Chloe and I am the Invasive Species Project Officer at Tees Rivers Trust, specifically working on Tees Operation Giant Hogweed, also known as Top Hog, which is a project funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund to manage giant hogweed in the Tees catchment. And in this video, I am going to be talking through some of the best ways to identify giant hogweed plants and what to do if you come across them. So for the purpose of ID today, we're going to look at 4 S's in order to identify giant hogweed. This will include the size of the plant, splotchy stems, sharply serrated leaves, similar species, and overall, does this result in a giant hogweed plant? So the first thing we're going to look at for our ID is the size of the plant. Given the name giant hogweed, you can imagine the plant is quite big. It can grow up to 5 meters tall, as you can see from some of the photos of people compared to some dried and flowering stems. Although they don't start off that way, once the plant reaches its flowering size, they are pretty easy to spot. And as an invasive species, giant hogweed tends to grow in large monocultures. A monoculture essentially means that the plant does not allow any other native species to grow. So you can see huge dense areas of just one plant, in this case giant hogweed. That isn't to say this is always the case. There are exceptions to the rule, as you can imagine. One example of this would be that a bird would eat a seedling of giant hogweed. It goes to another area and releases a seedling in its droppings, which can be left away from the original site, meaning it's possible to see kind of standalone or small. The next is splotchy stems. So giant hogweed stems are not like kind of what you would see as a usual plant stem, and that it's not all green. One fairly common way to identify giant hogweed is seeing the kind of purple and green splotchy stems. So they also do have often thick white bristles on them, and the amount of green to purple is not the same on each plant, but it's enough to notice it. So the stems can be quite thick and hollow, but remember when you're having a look not to touch anything. You can normally see it from a distance, that they are kind of darker, and you can normally see the bristles from a distance as well. One key identifying feature is the leaves that a giant hogweed plant has. This feature can be really great if you can't see the stem very clearly or if it's not quite reached the full flowering height. The colour of the leaves are green, however they can vary between quite a light green, like quite bright as shown in the top left photo, but they can also be a dark green in colour, and the best part is to kind of look at the leaf shape instead of just the colour. They tend to have sharply serrated leaves, which you can see in all these photos. It kind of looks a bit like a nasty plant, doesn't look very nice. So that's definitely one way that you can ID a giant hogweed plant, is by the leaves. Just to be aware, when the winter months come, the leaves do tend to die away, so you won't be able to see them as often as you can in the spring and summer months. So the last thing we're going to have a look at is similar species to giant hogweed, as there are quite a few plants that it kind of gets confused with, especially when the plant is a lot smaller and the leaves and stems are not as prominent as they are as they get kind of closer to the flowering stage. So I'm going to talk through the most 3 common plants that giant hogweed can be compared to. So the first one is common hogweed. Common hogweed is probably the plant that most often gets confused with giant hogweed, which is for good reason. They have, they're in the same plant family. However, common hogweed is a lot smaller than giant hogweed, and it's usually more between 4 to 6 feet as opposed to 16 feet. So it tends to be a lot smaller, and it doesn't tend to cause the same burns that giant hogweed causes. However, there have been some reports of individuals being sensitive to common hogweed sap, which may result in a rash rather than a burn. So that's just to be aware of anyway. The second plant easily mistaken is cow parsley. Again, they're in the same family like common hogweed. Cow parsley is a lot smaller. The leaves are a lot smaller compared to the rest of the plant, and they tend to have several small flower heads rather than one big one. The stems are a lot thinner and more spindly. So that's a plant that kind of looks a bit similar, but if you were to compare the two, a lot smaller. And then the last plant which can be mistaken for giant hogweed is butterbur. Similarly to giant hogweed, they do tend to take over large areas of land. However, the leaves are a completely different shape. Where giant hogweed has sharp serrated leaves, butterbur tends to be rounded, almost circular. And once butterbur flowers, they are easier to identify as the flowers are completely different to those of giant hogweed. So those are kind of the main 4 things to look out for when you're looking for a giant hogweed plant. So the last thing I'm just going to mention is what to do if you come across a giant hogweed plant. The first thing to do is to avoid it, especially if you're unsure if it definitely is giant hogweed or not. You might come across a similar species, but you're not 100% sure whether it is or isn't, so it's best to just avoid it anyway. Make sure not to touch it, and if you are with other people, such as children, make sure they don't touch it either, just in case. The second thing to do would be to report it. On the last page, I'll talk about extra resources for you to have a look at if you'd like more information. But essentially, if you see giant hogweed, make sure to take a photo of it and report it using iRecord. Remember not to get too close and don't put yourself at danger or at risk if you're close to somewhere where it's growing, such as a riverbank. And the last thing would be to raise awareness. We're currently in the process of trying to raise awareness for giant hogweed as well as the management of it, but we can't do it on our own. We need your help, so make sure that you're sharing anything that might help raise awareness of this plant. So there are several extra resources which you can find online that will give you more information about the work being done on giant hogweed, both in the UK, in the Tees catchment, in your area, and how you can go about identifying it. And the main resources we recommend include looking at the GBNNSS website, which is the Non-Native Species Secretariat. It's a government-led organisation who have a lot of resources about invasive species and what you can do to kind of prevent them from spreading. Our website also has lots of information about our current Top Hog project and the work we're doing in the Tees catchment, as well as some other work that we're doing on other invasive species and just work in the catchment in general to improve the area. The third resource we recommend having a look at is the Centre of Agriculture and Biosciences International, also known as CABI. They have some great resources about giant hogweed and their kind of current work on management techniques for now and in the future, so they're also good to have a look at. And lastly, iRecord is a free way to report invasive species. You can either get it as an app on your phone or you can use the desktop version. You simply take a photo and either use the website or the app to report it, and it goes to the correct person who needs to look after it if you're in a certain area. So those are the main resources that we'd recommend having a look at if you're wanting to find out more information about invasive species. So I hope this video has been helpful in identifying giant hogweed. And let us know in the comments if there's any more information you would like to know about invasive species or any of the other projects that we're currently working on. Thank you.